Hello and welcome back. This session is all about who Sonlight is and what makes Sonlight curriculum different. So if you've already joined us this morning, you know we gave you a little insight into how to get started homeschooling. And one of those pieces of information and things you have to do is choose your curriculum. So if you're brand new to Sonlight, or maybe you're considering switching to Sonlight, Christy and I wanted to share a little bit more about who Sonlight is, what the educational philosophy is behind it, and why Sonlight curriculum might be a good fit for you. So before we jump into that, let's go ahead and start with some introductions. Christy, do you want to tell everyone a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I'm Christy, and I have been homeschooling with Sonlight for 15 years. I first encountered Sonlight years ago before I was a mom. I met my husband, and I was living overseas, and the curriculum was chosen for me by a family. And so I loved it. I was impressed and loved it so much that I chose to use it for my family. And it's been a great fit for our family. We have two in high school and two in college, and they're thankful for their Sonlight education. I'm thankful for the years that we've had together and continue to have, but they're in a more independent stage right now and moving even more independence. So it's been a great journey, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much for being here. If you did not join us earlier today, you haven't met me yet either, so I'll introduce myself as well. I am Sunny. I'm Sonlight's community and social media manager, and I'm also a Sonlight mom. I started homeschooling my older child way back in preschool in 2012 with the intention of only going for a year or two before I put her in school. But we were loving it. We were having so much fun learning together that we kept going. And now that student has finished up her ninth grade year and will be a sophomore in high school next year. My younger child came along 5 years later, and so he will be entering fifth grade in the fall. So I'm also excited to be here and talk a little bit more about why I fell in love with Sonlight and why I've continued to use it all these years later. So before we dive into all the details, though, we're going to tell you a little bit about what types of questions we'll be answering and what things we'll be talking about. Because if you're brand new to Sonlight, you may not even know much about the curriculum yet. So first, we're going to talk about what literature-based means, which Sonlight is the original literature-based curriculum. The company was founded more than 30 years ago with literature as its foundation. So we'll describe what that means to you as a homeschool parent. What's something else that is critical or crucial about Sonlight?
Very important that it's a Christian curriculum, but it is unique among Christian curriculum options, I would say. So talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Sonlight also has a global focus that you don't always find from American companies. We were founded by Americans in the United States, but our focus is not just on our own country. So that is something very important to a lot of homeschoolers and especially to our international customers. So we will highlight some of the things that make us different there as well. And then what else are we going to do?
We're going to talk about how to use the curriculum, how to use Sonlight, and we're going to talk about the all-important instructor's guide, and we're going to try to not say IG to confuse those of you who are new, but that is instructor's guide. The instructor's guides are important, and then just how the notes tell you, what you're going to read and when, and all the information that is important.
Yes, because Sonlight's very easy to use too, so we will explain that. It's also an engaging, natural way to learn. You don't have to rely on tests and classroom styles of learning when you homeschool. And I think Sonlight is an excellent curriculum at showing you another way and more interesting ways to learn.
Going to talk about how Sonlight's not segmented into different grades and subjects, and each of your children need each of these things. We're going to talk about how the grades and subjects can be used in different ways, different learning styles, and for different ages.
Absolutely. So no matter what age your student is or what type of learner they are, they can thrive with Sonlight. So we'll talk about that. Also, Sonlight offers a 100% money back guarantee, which is unique. A lot of other curriculum providers don't offer anything close to this, but it allows you to try the curriculum and see how it works. And if it doesn't, you can send it back to us and get your money back. So it's a huge benefit. Which, speaking of, that's how we'll wrap up. We'll share all the benefits. What are some like offhand benefits that you can think of right away, Christy?
I would say the critical thinking skills that come from all of the great reading that we do, different perspectives that we hear from, help us to develop those critical thinking.
Absolutely. All right, so let's dive in now that you have a little bit of an idea of what all we're going to talk about. And of course, if you're watching us live, ask those questions in the chat as well. We would love to answer any questions you might have. So drop those in there, and we are recording this so you can come back and watch it later. But let's start with literature based. I think one of the first things when people start looking at curriculum is they'll hear terms thrown out like classical or Charlotte Mason or workbooks or video online. They hear all these different things. And literature based, if you're not familiar with what that is, might sound completely foreign. You may not have any idea what that means. What does that mean when we're talking about curriculum and really the format of Sonlight?
It can be like learning a new language when you enter the homeschool world. But it's just basically learning that is centered around stories. So that whether we're learning history or geography or language, which in language arts includes reading or writing, and even in science, in all of those subjects, we are getting absorbed in a very engaging story that helps, what we learn become more memorable and leaves us wanting more because when you're reading a story you want the next chapter. And so as you're learning about for example, a family that lives in Italy, then you're going to look at the map and you're going to find that on the map. And so through that literature and through that story, it is very engaging, and you're learning the geography as you go. If you're learning about a family in Montana, then you're going to look on the map and you're going to find, and even as you're learning about and you're getting absorbed in the story and you're finding that they went on a trip through these mountains, you can find that on the map. That's part of geography. If you're studying science and you're talking about a difficult subject like waves, that's a very abstract subject, but there's a great book in Sonlight in level D that talks about waves, and it includes just a picture book about someone in the mid 1900s who does a research that is actually in our cell phones today. And it talks about music, and it includes this whole story of her life. And while you're learning about that kind of on the sly, you're learning some great concepts in science. And so if your child is not a science person, they're going to still learn some of those concepts in what you're learning in your story.
Well, and I love the way you described that you're kind of learning it on the sly. And that's so true of so many of the Sonlight books because you're engaged in the story and it's fun, and you feel like you're just reading a story, right? You're hearing events that happened, you're learning about people. Well, they are also bringing to life that time period wherever the story is set, or that country, that location, or that scientific topic. So if you have a child who maybe is like, oh, I don't like history or I don't like science, but then you bring in that story format, it makes it so much more engaging for them. And I love too that you mentioned the picture books. A lot of times, if you're using literature to learn, but the child has no frame of reference for what that looks like, that can be a little tricky for them to imagine what you're talking about. So Sonlight does a really great job of weaving in picture books along with those narrative stories so that a child who maybe hasn't seen that country before or hasn't seen waves, maybe you live way far from the ocean and so they've never seen something like that, they're able to imagine that and picture that because, again, you have that resource as well. So I think Sonlight does an excellent job of making learning fun and bringing things to life Also, Christy brought up the geography piece of it, which is something that is very natural. When you're reading a story, Sonlight actually includes maps in the curriculum. And so, like she said, if you're reading about a family in Italy, you're going to go find Italy on the map together and mark that down. And we also utilize a timeline book as well for history. So if you're learning about the Crusades, you're going to go figure out where that is on the timeline relative to modern history as well as beginning of time. And so that is another great resource that's included in your history Bible literature programs. We will break down later on today in more detail the different components of a Sonlight package. So don't worry too much about that. We'll explain that later, but you will hear us say things like history Bible literature, or she mentioned the IG, the instructor's guide. And so we'll try not to use those terms that are confusing, but we will explain all of those things as well. Now let's talk about the Christian curriculum. This was a huge motivator for me in the curriculum I chose. I wanted it to be a Christian curriculum, but as someone who grew up in a Christian home and went to Christian school for many years, when I got out in the world in college at my public university, I was kind of bombarded by all these ideas and things that I had never heard before. And so it was important that I not only found a Christian curriculum, but one that would adequately prepare my kids for when they entered the world. And you alluded to it earlier, but let's talk about how Sunlight is a Christian curriculum, but also how it's different than some of the other Christian curriculums today and how it really helps prepare students for life.
I would say that this was one of the most important thing, or the most important thing to me whenever I was choosing a curriculum. This is what I wanted to do. That's more important to me than anything that my boys. I really want them to be centered in Christ. I want them to know the Bible. I want them to be encouraged by the truth of the Bible and the gospel, and to be, wanting to share that with others. Those are some of my goals when I started. And Sunlight has a scheduled Bible component for every history Bible literature package has a scheduled Bible component, but also there are Bible references and just a biblical worldview at the basis of the curriculum. And so, and that is without shying away also from hearing different perspectives and knowing the history of those perspectives too. And so it was really great for my guys to hear, even within the church, there are different ideas about different parts of the Bible. There are different interpretations, and my sons had a good chance to hear both sides on some of those things. We are looking at these scriptures. We are looking at these scriptures, and there are debates in some of the books that my son told me when he went away to a Christian college, actually, that he appreciated, because there were some students who came to campus as Christian, from a Christian family, but they didn't know that there were other Christians who had different interpretations of certain big ideas in the Bible. And there are definitely different camps on different things. And we had a chance to talk about some of those. So all throughout the years, though, there is that scheduled Bible component, and lots of opportunities to talk about what's most important.
Yeah, I agree. And something else that I really like, you brought up, even within the Christian church, the differences in views, is that Sunlight does not come at it with this is the one thing that all Christians believe and this is the only right way. There's a lot of room for you as the parent to explain to your student what you believe, what your family believes, maybe what your denomination believes, those types of things, and how they might be different, which to me was super helpful because it gives you as the parent enough notes and enough guidance that you kind of have a jumping off point. But the curriculum is not telling them this is the one right way, a very black and white thing, because as we know, the world is not all black and white. And when you grow up, sometimes your views are challenged. So I love that Sunlight's Bible programs also include more of those apologetics resources as the students get older. So they are not only able to explain what they believe, but they can defend why they believe. And you can wrestle these issues out together. I love the conversations that I have with my own students, and to be able to say, well, what do you think about that? And my daughter is currently finishing up the History of the Christian Church high school program that Sonlight does. And it's been really fun for us to say, oh, well, this church at this time believed this. Do we agree with that still? Is there something, maybe we agree with this, but not that? And you don't have the same, I think, crisis of faith moments because you are able to question and rationalize and figure things out together. So I love that about Sonlight. Also, you will find secular resources as well, that if the content is good, Sonlight will still use it, but then they provide notes saying, okay, well, this book maybe is taught from a perspective where they say millions and millions of years. So here's how you might handle it if you disagree with that. Which is somebody who my degree is in a science. I love that my kids are hearing all the different scientific theories and viewpoints because there are a lot of differing opinions on that. And so the fact that Sonlight weaves all these things in, but then explains from that Christian worldview that Christy mentioned, okay, here's what a believer would think about that, I think is super helpful. Something else that Sonlight does is include missionary stories as well. In addition to the true like Bible reading, scripture memory, you're also going to learn about missionaries who went around the world and did big things. They're inspirational stories. Your children will learn from them. But that is just one of the ways that Sonlight has a focus, not just inwardly, right? We want to not only know God ourselves, but also to share him with other people. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the global focus that Sonlight has, Christy?
Yes, I love this is one of the most important things to me. I lived overseas before I was a mom, and my world was opened through living in a different place. And I wanted my children to learn more than I did as a child about the world and about different places and places that they have not been and may not ever be. I wanted them to be able to have just a perspective of that. And so Sonlight does give us that opportunity again through the literature as we read stories about people all around the world. Um, we're really absorbed in a culture, and you can learn about that culture and, different things that you may not have a background in. I like that we started off, our first year was in world history. And that was so great because when I was a child, I learned, we started off with ourselves, and then we moved out with our community, and then we learned about, and you can, structure that however you would like to. But for me, I didn't know who the French and the Spanish and I didn't know. I had no background for that. There was a German lady in my church, so I knew her, but I didn't have an attachment to a big attachment to that. We learned a lot about missionaries at church. I did, but and so there was a little bit there as well, geography focus. But this was in a huge way through reading stories about families all around the world and the problems that a little boy or little girl might encounter throughout the day in their town, in the world. And so that is a little bit about the global focus, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it's huge because, like you said, a lot of times a child's frame of reference for the world is what they know. So it's their neighborhood, it's their community, their family, their climate. I mean, everything is what they know. And I've often said it jokingly, but it's also true. My own educational experience, once we got to the 1700s and the United States was a country, I wasn't learning anything about anywhere else in the world unless the United States was involved in it. And that was not how I wanted to raise my kids because in the 19th and 20th century, things were happening in other places. It wasn't just in the US. But my own educational experience was very US centered, and I did not want that for my kids. I wanted them to realize that there are people around the world who are similar to them and different than them, but I wanted them to recognize what those similarities and differences were. And without ever learning about them, there would have been no way to do that. And so Sunlight actually they do have American history, but they also have world history and Eastern Hemisphere and world cultures and all these different parts that are included in the curriculum so that you are not just learning about people that are exactly like you. And like Christy said, you'll learn about, the things that are happening in other parts of the world through the perspective of other children. Oftentimes, our stories are age based or kind of around the age of the student that you're reading to or that is reading them. And so it's super helpful because that child can now envision a place that is very different than their own and maybe see that, oh, well, I'm very similar to this character, or I would react the same way he or she did. And so, yeah, I just think that's huge, and it's something that I've really enjoyed with my kids, and their geographic knowledge is just so much better than mine was too, because they've learned that way all along.
And when you look at a map after you've done Sonlight, then your children can say, oh, that is where, and they know this character. That is where Maya is from. That is where, they can name characters when they look at the map and they know about that character. They know that story, and it's more engaging.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't know if you said it earlier, but it's almost like you learn yeah, you were talking about learning on the fly. You learn without even realizing it. So the knowledge your kids will have without even realizing it because they know Maya or because they know another character, that they've read about. It's just so much deeper. And then you as a family, because you read those books together, also have almost like an inside scoop or something that you share together, that shared experience, because it was like you were there as a family. So just it makes learning so much better, I think, than let me memorize this boring paragraph about something that makes no sense to me, right? It wasn't real to me because I didn't read a story. So let's talk about that. Like, how do you use Sonlight? Because I love to read books. I love all things books. And I'm sure a lot of people that are watching this also love to read. And that's why they're here. But does Sonlight turn a stack of books or a whole shelf of books into an actual curriculum? Like, that just seems a little confusing if you're unfamiliar with how Sonlight works. So what is it that Sonlight does to turn all of those wonderful books into a full curriculum that actually teaches your kids all the academic subjects?
Well, Sunlight gives you a map. They give you a guide. It's called the Instructor's Guide. And 15 years in, I'm still a huge fan of the Instructor's Guide. It is the most important thing for scheduling. It gives you a schedule, not just for your day. Um, it gives you, you can just look at one column and know that this is everything I'm doing today in this subject. And it brings a feeling of peace. Okay, I may not be able to do everything, but I can do this today. It just breaks it down for you. And then you have notes beyond that, where it gives you everything you're going to need for that day. And it's in an organized way where you know exactly where to look. You can use highlighters to divide it and know exactly where to go. I did that kind of thing to get, put stars beside what I needed for each day, or, made divisions with highlighters so that I could know. But it's all right there in your schedule page. And then behind your schedule page, you have everything you need for 1 week. And then even beyond that, there is in the back a scope and sequence that gives you at a glance for the entire 36 weeks what you need. Not what you need, but what you're going to do. So you can just kind of look at it and get an overview and compare. It's amazing. There are notes to tell you what to read and when, and even since I've been doing this, Sonlight has added scripting where in little pink boxes, you just look at the pink boxes and it says say, and then it tells you what to say. So it's very doable. It's something that it's a great tool for you to know exactly where to start, what we're doing today, and everything you need to know to teach your children.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally love that schedule piece. I like having a schedule, but I did not want to create my own and worry that I was forgetting something or missing something I needed to cover. And then also the discussion questions. I have one child who I can say, "What did we read about?" And he can tell me in great detail what we read about and narrate very well. But my other child, she kind of needed a push, a starting point of like, okay, well, what did we learn about? But then she could answer very specific questions, about whatever we had read, but it was helpful to have those prompts of, okay, here's the key points that we wanted to get out of that. I don't need you to recite the entire thing back to me, but here's what we were trying to learn there. And there's vocabulary in there. So if you're unfamiliar with a word yourself, you don't have to go look it up. It's already right there for you, which is super convenient. And like what Christy said, the scripting super helpful in language arts, I think, when you're trying to explain grammatical rules or even how to teach your child how to read. I remember that was something that early on I thought, how do I actually teach that? I know how to do it now, but I don't know how to teach a child to read. Like, where do you even begin? And with Sonlight's language arts, it was very easily spelled out. Okay, here's the letter we're learning. Here's what it sounds like. Demonstrate it for your child. Let them say it back to you, syllables, all of that. And so once I taught that first child how to read, I was like, okay, I've got this. But Sonlight made it very easy because it was all there in the instructor's guide telling me how to do it. So if you're looking at this and you're intimidated at the thought of, oh my goodness, how am I going to teach my child everything I need to know? The instructor's guides are fantastic for moving the student at the age that it recommends it for. And then by high school, the student gets their own guide that's written to them. And so they're able to work totally independently if you want them to. But then you have a parent guide so you can still facilitate conversations with them even if you don't have time to read all of their books. I know my daughter is a voracious reader and I love to read too, but I cannot keep up with her. And so I'm able to use my parent guide to still have great discussions, even if she is way ahead of me in those books or has read way more. I have big plans to come back and read them later when I have time, but I definitely cannot match her pace and still homeschool my younger student. And so the Sonlight instructor's guides make it so much easier to do all of those things. And so, yeah, you just go through and look at the box and, okay, here's what's scheduled. Let me read it. We'll discuss it, move on to the next book. And we will talk later today about modifying your approach. So if you feel like, oh my goodness, this is super rigorous or that's not going to work for my child, we will explain ways to simplify that as well and different approaches to using it. But it really is super easy and it's ready to go immediately. So you can start teaching the very next day if you want, which I also think is super helpful. But let's talk about the actual learning, teaching, discussion based piece of it, because I think sometimes the thought of that is a little intimidating if somebody's wondering, well, how do I know if my child is learning anything? It almost sounds too easy, right? To just read and discuss books like that you might be wondering, okay, well, how do I know if my child's learning, or how am I going to make sure they're learning what they need to learn? Because that approach is so different than what most of us are familiar with in a classroom. So what do you say to that, and how does literature-based learning really work in that regard?
I would say it's very flexible for your family, and it is discussion based. So if we've read about a story, um, and they're engaging in that story, and they can't wait for the next chapter, and they're asking questions, then and then you've had discussions, you've stopped along the way when they when they start talking about, oh wait, is this the same person as we learned about in our other history book? Wait a minute, I didn't know Samuel Adams was a real person, but he's in this book and he was in that book, so I think he's a real person. They start to make connections, they start to ask questions that are beyond anything that would be on a second grade history test or a second grade, language arts test or a reading test. When as you're reading, they start asking questions. So you've already done that with them, and then at the end, there are the discussion questions. We do these aloud. That was kind of foreign to me whenever I first started, because I'm like, wait a minute, what are they going to write down, and what am I going to grade, and how is that going to all work? But as you're going, you do see, oh, wow, they're learning so much more than I knew at this age, because they're mapping, you're finding your points on the timeline, or you're placing your figures on the timeline in time. And then as you're doing that, you're seeing, oh wait, this person lived before Julius Caesar. I didn't know that. Or this person lived here. This person lived there. All of these things that you're adding to your map. If it is, I mean, to your timeline, to the map, you're putting the points on the map and finding where people lived and that type of thing. And so there's so much discussion that happens that by the end, there's no quiz needed. I mean, we might talk about it as we're driving down the road if I think that they weren't really, if they didn't catch part of the details, we can talk about it. One of my guys was struggling at one point, and so I actually had him just draw pictures after he had read. And he did that better sometimes than the discussion question. So it's flexible where you can do something like that. And then I would look at his picture, and I could tell from the picture whether he we could look at the picture, and he's got some characters in the tree that were not in a tree. And I can say, oh, in this part of the story, and I could explain to him what was happening. Oh, that makes more sense because the person who said this, I didn't understand that when we were reading it. So you're right there with them. You see what they're learning as you go, and there's no test that's needed really for that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know too that you're not just going to read about one thing one time and then that's it, and they have to know it and they remember it that way. Sunlight uses a layered approach of multiple books and resources, and so eventually those connections, like what Christy's talking about, are very obvious and intuitive to them. So, like, for example, I'm thinking of the books I recently read with my son. In history, he's learning about the Irish potato famine and why that caused such an influx of immigration through New York City in the early 1800s. He was also learning about the Battle at the Alamo and some of these men who fought there, who were heroes of the War of 1812, which he had just learned about in another book. And then in another read aloud, he's learning how a family was living at the time in the woods and how they had to be very careful about saving up food because if they got a lot of snow, the crops would not grow. And so it's all these different types of things that are happening and all the different things that are happening in the same time period. But then he's able to figure out other information that maybe he hasn't learned based on all of those kind of contextual clues. So if somebody says, oh, what was happening in this place, well, this was happening, he can usually kind of intuit that and figure it out. Or he was learning something else and I was like, what time period do you think that was? And he started using these different clues of, oh, well, in this book, this boy was hunting with this weapon, and in this book this was happening, and oh, I don't think there were trains yet, so it must have been. And he was figuring out that information. And this is my 10-year-old. So as kids get older, it gets even easier to do that. But you'll discover you revisit the same time periods and through a variety of different resources. And so it makes it, I don't want to say obvious, but it does become obvious to your student without having to remember this war was fought from this year to this year, and kind of that factual memorization that you might get with other curriculums or maybe the way you learned in school. But a student can figure that out because, oh, I read Johnny Tremaine that was set in the Revolutionary War, and I know that was the 1770s and 80s, and like they're able to figure those things out. So that's something that I find I learn all the time. I love what you said about the timeline, Christy, because there are times that I thought I knew, oh yeah, this happened in this year, but then I'm like, oh, that was the same time this was happening here in this other part of the world, and I had never made that connection before using the Sunlight timeline with my students. So I find that I learn stuff all the time. It is very easy to get your students to that point. And then also, because you've been discussing these books with them, I think dropping learning into everything becomes very easy as well. I mean, we can go anywhere as a family, and I know what my kids have been learning about, which is one of the things I love about homeschooling. I don't have to wait for them to come home and say, "What'd you learn today?" And they don't remember anymore, right? I'm able to say, "Oh, we read this book about this, and this is where it happened. Look at that," and they're able to see that and get that frame of reference. And so for me, it's really exciting as a homeschool parent to have this discussion based, engaging way to learn. And it is something that the longer you do it, the easier it gets. So if you're new and you're saying, "Oh my gosh, there's no way I will ever get to that point," or "I don't come from a teaching background," or "I didn't like school," or whatever your hesitation might be, I assure you that it does become very natural and easy to teach these things to your kids, and you know exactly what they know or don't know based on their conversations with you. I love the idea to draw pictures too, because sometimes we think our kids are getting it because we get it, and then they say something, or maybe their picture is a little off, and you're like, "Well, wait a second, what did you think that meant?" "Oh no, that's not what it meant." So you're able to clarify things for them, I think, a lot quicker too than if they're just memorizing a fact.
Yes. And I was going to say that, the part where you were talking about the layered approach, when Sunlight uses not just, novels or literature, but we also have history books. And when you're reading those books, if you just pick that up by itself, you might say, "Oh, I don't know if they're going to engage with this." But you have to remember, on a 2-page spread, when you're talking about a concept in history or a time period, as you're going, it might mention in 2 little sentences something about the Irish, potato famine. And then you've read these great books. You've read Nori Ryan's song. And so you've just finished that. And so when you get to that part, your kids are like, "Oh, I know about this." So then there's a little explosion happening in their brain as you go through. So it might be a 2-page spread that if you weren't reading this great literature, then they would just read and it would just be like, "Okay, that was kind of an engaging way to say it, but I'm not really connecting with that." But if you have all these great stories and all this learning, that's what, when we get to, some of the stories in, thinking of A Child's History of the World, or these books that are covering the history part, um, that layer of the stories that you're reading really make that come alive. And so it kind of supports each other. It gives a little more of the details of the history in that 2-page spread that you're reading about the history, maybe time period or event, if you're talking about a war or something like that. But they have all of this great background that you're giving them from reading, just the stories that go along with the curriculum.
That's such a great point. Yeah, that the history comes with a spine, so that yeah, the student is getting frame of reference for all of these books they're reading. And same thing with science. I love that some science curriculum includes a scientist each year where you can learn a little bit about their life. I've always loved biographies and those types of things, but it also brings to life for the student not just these scientific ideas, but also, okay, well, how did that person figure that out? And what was the thought process behind that? How did they determine that? And now this is what we know. And here's the scientific process and all of that. So to me, it makes all of those subjects so much more engaging. And it is super simple once you start doing it. So we actually, this was not something I put in here to talk about, but it made me think about it. If you have not taken the Sonlight invitation to try Sonlight, if you're watching this and you're wondering, like, "I still don't get how it works," we'll drop the link here in the chat for you so that you can do that. But you can actually get a free book with the instructor's guide notes that go along with it. And we have different age levels as well. So if your student's very young or older, in the middle, and so you can actually kind of test drive the Sonlight way of learning, to see if that's a good fit for you. So we'll put that in here too, because that is something, if you're brand new and have no idea even what we're talking about, it makes a little more sense once you start doing that. And also, Sonlight covers all grades, all subjects, and it can be used for a variety of learning styles. So that sounds like a lot when you're thinking, "Oh my gosh, a preschooler versus like a high school senior. How are we going to teach them everything? History, math, Bible, science, language arts, all the different subjects, plus electives." Can you talk a little bit more about that, Christy? Just kind of what we carry and how it can work. Say you've got a kid that loves to read, Sunlight seems perfect. But what about your child who doesn't love to read, or maybe is more kinesthetic and needs hands-on? How does Sunlight also work for those students as well?
Hmm. So whether you have a student who loves to read and is begging you for more books, or whether you have a student who is avoiding books and wants to, I have a son who asked how many pages, and he would always look at how many pages because he was concerned about how much he was going to have to read. So I have both of those, and Sunlight has been a great fit for all of my guys, from the eager readers, the most eager readers, and the ones that were what the school would say advanced readers, all the way to just people who were avoiding reading. I had people avoiding reading in my house at the beginning, and I would find one of my guys, I would find kind of sacked out in the floor in the living room with a history book. He told me he didn't like history one day, and I said, "What? You can't say that. We do Sunlight," And I found him sacked out with a history book, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I just wanted to learn more about castles because we read about them, but it's been a little while, and I remembered some of the things, but I wanted to write some things about castles, and I needed to do some studying about them to know how to write about them." And I'm like, okay, I think he likes history. And I said to him, "What, I think you like history because, and he was like, "Oh, did I say I didn't like history? I really like history, I guess," and, it's just what he said on any given day. But yes, whether you have an eager reader or whether you have reluctant readers, Sunlight really does kind of on the slide, like we said, engage them. There's something for everyone. There are books that my oldest loved, and it was his, that a book that was his favorite. And then the next book we would read, and he didn't, I mean, he learned some things from that book. And then the next son that I came along, it was his favorite book. And so you're going to have a mix of styles. Some books we would read and then think, I would think, oh, maybe they didn't, gain that much from that. And then 2 months later, they would start just talking about, or I would find them playing and they were acting out the story. And it was amazing.
Yeah, something that I liked about Sunlight that I saw was okay, they've got preschool through high school, because I think, even though I thought I was only going to do it one year, there was probably that thought in the back of my mind of, okay, well, if we do like it, I don't want to change things. And so I was glad to see that Sunlight would carry me through high school if I went that route. But I genuinely did not believe I was going to be homeschooling in high school until my older child was probably in sixth grade. So it's not a decision that you have to make immediately, but I was excited to see that Sunlight could carry me the whole way if I wanted them to. And I loved, I mentioned earlier, I love to read. So for me, a lot of my reasons for choosing Sunlight was because I wanted to enjoy what I was teaching. I knew that if I chose a curriculum that, was great for my student who was 3 at the time, so really what did I know yet about her personality or her learning style, but I didn't like it, that it would not last very long or it would be a miserable experience. And so for me, being able to read all day to my kids, that was kind of a dream come true. Who doesn't want to read to their kids? And I think even if you are not a natural reader, we know now by reading all the studies that we should read to our kids. And so for me, I was like, well, even if I read nothing else to my children, if I'm reading them the Sunlight books, they're going to have a really good grasp of what's important in the world, what matters. They're going to read some great quality literature. I loved that preschool, pre-K, it was a lot of those classic books that I remembered from my own childhood. And then as you get up into the high school, again, books that I remember reading when I was in high school. And so that I thought was great, just knowing that I would have this great experience with my kids. But also, like Christy said, I have one that loves to read. My daughter she learns the same way I do. She's interested in a lot of the same things. Now, her favorite genre of literature and genres are different from mine, but she loves to read. She is constantly listening to a book when she's doing other things and reading. And I do credit Sunlight with introducing her to books early on, like that. My son, on the other hand, is not. I think if it were not for Sunlight, he would probably never pick up a book unless somebody forced him to. Learning to read was very challenging for him, and it was not something that he enjoyed. But I have discovered two things with him. Once he learned to read and started to see other books that he thought were cool or were about topics he was interested in, he did get very invested in them. And then the other thing is that he loves audiobooks. And I think a lot of that is because with Sunlight, I've been reading to him. And really, he was in the room when I was reading to my daughter before he was doing school. So he's heard me read to him since he was born a lot. And so now, if he's looking for an activity to do, we can oftentimes turn on an audiobook for him, and he's super engaged with that. He's learning something without having to do the hard work of reading himself. That child is also way more active. So those of you who have active children and you're like, oh no, my kid could never sit and listen to a book because they'd have to hold still. We will talk more about this in our modifying your Sunlight session as well. But your child, the nice thing with literature based is that they don't have to sit. They're not sitting at a desk writing something down for a large portion of their day. There, of course, math, you kind of have to write that, or if you're writing a paper, you have to write that. But a lot of your other learning you can do standing on your head or laying on the floor or bouncing on an exercise ball or whatever you want to do that does not involve sitting, you can do with literature. And so that is something that I loved for my son when he wanted to be up and moving around. And even my daughter, when she was little, there were times we would say, okay, let's stop. Everybody stand up, do jumping jacks, run, go touch the front door, and then go touch the back door and run back and forth. We would do these different tricks to get the kids back on task. But with a book, it's very easy to take that break. Let me pause here at the end of this paragraph. We'll get up and move around. Plus, you can add those hands-on activities like drawing along with your literature, or Sunlight's hands-on history kits. They have all the materials included there, so they can create this little craft that goes along with what they learned about. Same thing with the science experiments. They get to touch and do the tactile things that your hands-on learners would enjoy too, and it's still engaging for them. So yes, I absolutely agree with Christy that it does not matter if your child likes to read or doesn't like to read, because they can still learn a lot from great literature. And if you have a child that really, says they hate it at home, you can always put on an audiobook in the car, because now they're a captive audience and they will listen and they will enjoy it. So yeah, there's just so many options with that. And I will say that my even my non-reader discovered that books are fun and there are good ones, and that it's not just boring or hard. So I think that's important to know, if you're worried about that. And I know Sheila, one of the other Sunlight mentors, talks about her children. Two of them had dyslexia, and she was still able to use Sunlight. So, even if you're worried about something like that, like you think your child will not be able to read all of the books, there are ways to modify and use it that will work for your student. Let's talk about the money back guarantee, though. This was something else that, when I went to try Sunlight, I was like, oh, there's really no risk to me, right? The only thing I'm going to sacrifice is my time in using it. But if it's horrible and I don't like it, I can return it and get my money back. Can you talk a little bit more about the guarantee and what that means for people, if they're kind of on the fence and they're not sure what they want to do?
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that Sonlight wants you to love to learn, and they want you to love to teach. That is their goal. And so they've made all of these changes over the years, and they've done all of these things. They listen to feedback. When you have feedback, it's so valuable to get in touch and say, if you find something, then there may be other people who find something. And so they have listened to that for all of these decades, and they have are very good listeners. And so they are so convinced that you will love to learn and love to teach that they offer this great guarantee.
We'll also drop that link in the chat as well, so
Mhm.
that people can go
Mhm.
straight to the webpage and see all the details.
Yes. And if you have questions as you're going, I think this is important. Check in with Sonlight. The advisors are available for you. The mentor team is available. We want to help and support what you're doing. But I think that's important. But if you do get to the point of realizing, this is not, I'm not loving to learn and loving to teach, then there is a money back guarantee, and that is, I think, a huge benefit. I don't know anyone who has a guarantee that compares to what Sonlight offers.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think you brought up a great point there too, that Sunlight does not just want to sell your curriculum and then we're done with you. Sunlight will support you the
Right.
whole way through, right? So we want to provide the best customer service to you. We want to provide answers to your questions. We want to help you out. And I think that guarantee is just another layer of protection for you when buy your curriculum, that, okay, well, if it doesn't work out, I can send it all back. Yeah, you can use up to half of your program and send it back. So it's not even like everything has to be in perfect condition. You didn't actually open it. You are able to open it and use it and see if it works for your family. Also, if you are not sure if it's working or what, our team will help you kind of troubleshoot some of those issues as well. And if you're curious about what you should buy in the first place, our advisors can kind of walk you through those options so that you can feel confident when you make that purchase that, okay, I'm buying what I need for my family, because we know no two homeschools are the same and you need to get what's going to work for your family. So that's something else that I love about Sonlight, is there are more programs than academic years of school. So you really can hone in on what your students are going to need. There's not just one program for fifth grade, for example. And so it gives you more options that way to really place your student in an area that they're going to learn from and that's going to be good for whatever maturity they're at, whatever age they're at, their learning abilities, all of that. So that is something, like I said earlier, I learn things all the time. Even Sunlight's kindergarten program, I learned things I did not know. So do not worry about that. Like, is it going to be, something that my child will learn from? Absolutely. And let's talk about some of those benefits. I always like to end on a high note anyway. And I think the longer I sunlight, the more I have seen those benefits and the fruits of that as my kids have gotten older and matured. And like you mentioned, you have two in college. So two that are adulting and then two that are still in your home. So you're seeing that even more, I'm sure. So let's talk about some of those benefits. What have you seen through your years of using Sunlight?
I think there are so many benefits. It's hard to narrow it down. Okay. We mentioned at the beginning, at the top, about the developing the critical thinking skills just through the variety of materials, the background, all of the ideas that we're learning from different perspectives. There's so much critical thinking that is built into the program. When you're reading about another person's perspective and entering their world and really listening to them, and giving them a hearing, when you're listening to a perspective, then it's hard to come away from that and not see how this person, a person that, if it's a real character, is made in the image of God, and lives in a different place, in a different time, but God placed them there, and God has a purpose for that place, and I'm learning about that place. There's so much critical thinking that happens in that helps you to see we're not the center of the universe, and to kind of, there's so much spiritual truth that we learn as we go. There's so much academic, there's so much, and the critical thinking is amazing. Also, I think just the love of learning and the depth of that. My guys, one of my sons is interested in, he's pursuing pre-med, and every time he learned about the new system of the body when we were learning in high school, he said, "Oh, I think I might want the endocrine system is so it controls so much. I had no idea." And as he learned about that, he thought, "Oh, maybe I want to do this." He had this love of learning, and he dug in. All of my boys have read books that I never assigned, far more in different topics of books that, if we get one book, then they say, "Oh, can I get the rest of the series for Christmas?" Or, that type of thing. So there's just a love for learning that does grow with Sonlight. as far as academic success, that has been huge for our boys. Sonlight also offers a scholarship. We haven't mentioned the scholarship. That's down the road, but after you have ordered a certain number of Sonlight levels, then you're eligible to apply. Your student is eligible to apply for a Sonlight scholarship. And one of my sons has benefited from that scholarship, and he appreciates that greatly. And basically, I would say all of my guys, I would say, have basically they're all different academically, but they've all grown, and it's so amazing to see how they've followed different paths. They're interested in different things, but Sonlight has prepared them for all of those, I think. And so it also supports you through the homeschooling journey, which I think the scholarship speaks to that as well. We care about your family beyond just these years.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you summed that up really well. The critical thinking skills, like you said, when you learn about someone else and you experience their life, you do realize that we as individuals are not the center of the universe, which I think is huge, right? Because that was definitely one of the things with my kids. I did not want to raise entitled children. I did not want my children to think that their world was all that mattered. And so, yeah, I love that you bring that to light, that when you learn about other people, you empathize with other people, and you realize that God loves all of us, which is so important. And then also hearing different perspectives gives you the opportunity to kind of weigh, well, okay, what do I think about this situation, right? That is a learned skill. You don't automatically have opinions on things. And sometimes, being told this is what's right without any option to kind of weigh out, well, do I think that's right? It doesn't adequately prepare people for adulthood. So I think by learning all of these different perspectives through all your years of Sonlight, it really does prepare you to think more critically about situations, which I think for younger generations is becoming even more important because of the amount of information and opinions that are being thrown at them online and other places. For them to really be able to figure out what they believe is so important. And like you said, that love for learning, it is, I think, impossible to walk away from even a year of Sonlight and not to have found something that you learned that you really enjoyed and you got to learn for learning's sake. I love what you mentioned. Your kids have all gone into different areas that they're interested in, but they've all dug further, right? They've read other things, they've researched the things that interest them, that they are able to enjoy that and seeing learning as a positive. This is something that I've mentioned many other times in other sessions, but I know, like, when I was in school, you only wanted to talk about academic things so much because you did not want to be labeled as, oh, you're sucking up to the teacher, or oh, you're a nerd, or whatever it might be. And I think for a child who's trying to grow up and go through life, if they're also worried about how they're going to be labeled in a classroom, the fact that they can just avoid all of that by learning and having fun together as a family, I think that's huge. And like you said, the academic success, the amount of books that you will read in a Sonlight program. My daughter and I were curious a couple of years ago, and we looked at the honors English class at the local school for her grade. I think they were reading like 7 or 8 books at an honors level. So that was not even just the traditional class that was maybe reading 4 books. And she's like, oh, that's like 1 or 2 weeks of Sonlight. Like, look at all these books that I'm reading. I was like, it's so true. It genuinely prepares your student for no matter what field they want to go into, which was something that when I started homeschool, I was very concerned about, am I going to limit them in some way? Am I going to prevent them from whatever academic or career pursuits they want down the line? And when I saw, okay, not only are these kids super articulate from a young age because they're developing the vocabulary from listening to all of these great books, but the amount of subjects that Sonlight covers and the time periods and all the different things that you're going to cover, truly it does prepare them in a way that me as an honors student in school was not anywhere close to prepared for. So I do know that when I launch these kids, they will be light years ahead of their peers who maybe don't have the study skills or the things yet because they've been had their hands have been held the whole time of you do this next, you do this, memorize this, there you go. And they're not really learning. They're just doing what they're told to do. So that was super, super important. And like we've already talked about, the Sonlight Connections community will support you through your journey. Sonlight has resources, but if you have not joined us in the Sonlight Connections app yet, there you have mentors that will help you out along your journey. Christy and I are in there, and we would love to answer your questions or give you advice. But then you also have the other community of Sonlight parents, so and grandparents. Now we have some grandparents homeschooling as well. But that way, you're not doing it alone. You're not on an island. We're not asking you to take on something super daunting all by yourself. And the amount of resources that you can gain and the understanding you can glean from other homeschoolers using Sonlight is just, it's huge. And so if you're brand new or if you've been there a while and you kind of have ideas to share, it's a great community. It's very positive and uplifting as well. And we pray for you throughout your journey too. So if you need anything at all, you're welcome to reach out to any of us in there. And we would love for you to join us there if you have not yet done that. So I'll put the link to the app in the chat as well, so that way you guys can join us over there. Thank you so much, Christy, for being here today. If you are joining us for this first session, we will have it available and you'll be able to go back and watch the one you missed this morning, but stick around with us and we're going to keep going all day, giving you more information. But Christy, thank you so much for being here and explaining a little bit more about who Sonlight is and what the curriculum's really like.
Thank you.